Hello guys, welcome back to the MedLife, and I hope you are doing well. So in the previous videos, we covered cerebrum and cerebellum. In this video, we're going to focus on the blood supply of the entire brain, the circle of Willis and structures related to that. This is a very main topic and it's a very common topic that is tested in the exams and students find it complicated. So we are going to through those arteries and blood supply of the brain. So this is an inferior view of the brain, and you can see some arteries over here, some blood supply. But we're going to look at it from the beginning, from the heart, from aorta, and how the arteries are coming from there and where the circle of Willis is made. So if you look at this picture, in this picture, we can see the aorta. This is the arc of aorta. This is the ascending aorta, descending aorta. This is the arc of aorta. From this arc of aorta, we have some branches. We have the subclavian arteries, the left subclavian artery, and the right subclavian artery, which is this one, the right subclavian artery. And this is a brachiocephalic trunk. But there is another artery that is coming direct from the aorta, the arc of aorta, which is the common carotid artery, the left common carotid artery, and this is the right common carotid artery. So we'll discuss these common carotid arteries in details in the circle of Willis. But first, before the common carotid, we should know this artery that is arising from the subclavian arteries. This, as I said, is the right subclavian artery, and this is the left subclavian artery. So this artery is the vertebral artery. We have two vertebral arteries, the left and the right vertebral arteries, which join to form the basilar artery, which we'll talk about it later. So this is direct from the heart. From the arc of aorta, we have left subclavian, here right subclavian, brachiocephalic trunk, and we have the common carotid arteries. From there, we'll continue talking about the circle of Willis. So, circle of Willis. First of all, what is the circle of Willis? So, the circle of Willis is a major arterial supplies of the cerebrum and cerebellum and in general the brain. Which is interconnected to one another at the base of the brain. Remember, this is at the base of the brain, inferiorly, on the inferior surface of the brain, at the base of the brain. And they form a six-sided polygon of arteries called the circle of Willis. So it's formed around the interpeduncula fossa, which we might cover. The interpeduncula fossa, it's a very important anatomical landmark, and the contents, the boundaries are very important, and it lies in the interpeduncular subarachnoid cistern. It contributes most of the arterial blood supply of the brain, as we discussed earlier. So if we look at this picture, this is a very zoomed picture as compared to the one we saw earlier. So here we have the vertebral arteries, the right vertebral artery and the left vertebral artery. So from these two join to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery has its own branches. Then from there we have these arteries and we have the posterior communicating artery. From there, from outside there, we get the internal carotid artery right over here. Then we have the middle cerebral artery. Then right over here is the anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery. We have then posterior communicating arteries. So this is the circle of Willis. Now we'll discuss the branches of each of these arteries. So the major arteries that form this circle of Willis is they are the internal carotid artery and the basilar artery and their branches. For those branches, we'll discuss them shortly. So this is a better view of the circle of Willis. So circle of Willis, as I said, is made up of internal carotid arteries, the branches of basilar arteries, posterior communicating arteries, anterior communicating artery, and we have the not the ophthalmic, and we have the anterior communicating anterior cerebral artery, and yeah, these are the major arteries that form the circle of Willis. So let's discuss about the branches of the vertebral arteries. Remember, this is only in the cranial part, which means this is on the superior part of the vertebral artery, the upper part. So it also has some other branches that we're not discussing here because it's only the blood supply of the brain. It has the anterior spinal artery, posterior spinal artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is also called the PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, the meningeal branches, and the medullary arteries, which go to medulla oblongata. And these meningeal branches, which go to meninges of the brain. And there's a mnemonic to remember this. All phones post my mood. All phones post my mood. Anterior spinal, posterior inferior cerebellar, meningeal, medullary. If you look at this picture, if you see this vertebral artery, this is the left vertebral artery and this is the right vertebral artery. So one of the branches we said is the anterior spinal artery, which goes to the spinal cord. And in the anteromedian fissure, it supplies the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. That's not our topic. Our topic is only in the brain, but that's the spinal cord. And we have the posterior spinal arteries, which we cannot see in this big picture, unfortunately. So the anterior spinal arteries are it's one artery, but they are joined of two different vertebral arteries. So the left vertebral artery and right vertebral artery give branches, and they join together to form the anterior spinal artery. Then there is another, the posterior spinal artery. Then we have the PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which in the blood supply of the cerebellum we have already discussed which part of the cerebellum it supplies. If you haven't watched that video, make sure to watch that. Different features of cerebellum and also its blood supply, and also meningeal branches, which are very small and little branches we cannot see from this picture, and the medullary branches. Now the basilar artery. The basilar artery, as already discussed, it is formed by joining of the two vertebral arteries. So the branches are superior cerebellar artery, labyrinthine artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is the ICA. That was the PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and this is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Remember, the inferior cerebellar artery is divided into two, anterior and posterior, but the superior is only one, superior cerebellar artery. Then we have the pontine branches and the posterior cerebral artery. So there is also a mnemonic for remembering the branches of the basilar artery, which is the SLAP with two P's, SLAP. So superior cerebellar, labyrinthine, anterior inferior cerebellar, pontine, and posterior cerebral. So again, in this picture, as I already mentioned, the basilar artery is formed by joining of the two vertebral arteries. It has the ICA, anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, right and left. And we have the superior cerebellar arteries. So remember, we have two cerebellar branches from the basilar arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar and the superior cerebellar. Remember, the PICA is a branch of vertebral, not a branch of basilar. Basilar has anterior inferior cerebellar and the superior cerebellar. Then these are the pontine branches. The pontine branches here, you can see them, which supply the pons. Then we have the posterior cerebral arteries, right and left. So this is the left and this is the right. So posterior cerebral arteries. Now, the branches of the internal carotid artery. As I already said, and I mentioned in that picture, the common carotid arteries are originally arising from the arc of aorta. So we have the left and right common carotid arteries. So the common carotid is not coming from the vertebral artery and it does not join from there, but it joins from up in the middle of the circle and gives branches that complete the circle of Willis. So these branches are the ophthalmic artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior choroidal artery, anterior cerebral artery, and middle cerebral artery. So remember, for the basilar artery, we have two cerebellar arteries, and for the internal carotid artery, we have two cerebral arteries, anterior and middle cerebral arteries. So there is also a mnemonic for this. My pen acts as old. My pen acts as old. So middle cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior choroidal artery, anterior cerebral artery, and the ophthalmic artery. Let's look at the picture. So this is the internal carotid artery. Remember, this is not coming from this side. This is coming from this side and joining the circle of Willis, and it's completing it. So first of all, this is the ophthalmic artery, which goes to the eye, and the ophthalmic artery, which goes through the optic canal and all those stuff. Then we have the anterior choroidal artery right over here. Then we have the posterior communicating artery, and we have the anterior cerebral artery, and we have the middle cerebral artery. Middle cerebral, anterior cerebral, ophthalmic, anterior choroidal, posterior communicating arteries. So the circle of Willis is completed with this, with the last artery, which is the internal carotid artery. And remember, the anterior cerebral continues from here and it goes to supply the cerebrum, some parts of the cerebrum, majorly the lateral surface of the cerebrum. And you can see here the anterior cerebral artery. And so between the left anterior cerebral artery and the right anterior cerebral arteries, we have this small artery which connects them, which makes them communicate. That's why it's called the anterior communicating artery. So remember, this behind over here was the posterior communicating artery, this one over here. So, and this one is the anterior communicating artery. Hope you guys loved this video, and please let me know if there is anything else I can make to help you in this medical school, especially in the first year. I'll be happy to listen to your comments, and see you in the next video.